Why are you insulting my mother? She is my father's wife. I will report you to him.
The dining room of the Park estate was a tomb of polished mahogany and suffocating tradition, illuminated by a baccarat chandelier that dripped with the cold arrogance of old money. Danielle Monroe sat at the far end of the table, her spine a column of unbreakable grace. She wore a dress of deep emerald silk that complemented the rich mahogany of her skin, a stark contrast to the pale, drawn faces of the family that had once tried to bury her. Across from her, the park matriarch, Xiao Yen, didn't bother to hide her disdain, her eyes raking over Danielle like she was a stain on the ivory tablecloth. The air was thick with the smell of expensive bulgogi and even more expensive malice. "It is curious, Danielle," Xiao Yen began, her voice a sharp, clinical edge that cut through the clinking of silver, "that you would show your face here after the unpleasantness of your departure. We assumed you had returned to Georgia to find a life more suited to your station. And yet, you return here, uninvited by any of us who truly matter, dragging a child into a house that has no room for him." Miho, Danielle's ex-husband, let out a jagged laugh, his face flushed with wine and the cruel pleasure of having an audience. "Station? Mother, she was a waitress who thought a wedding ring was a lottery ticket. She hasn't changed. She's just learned to dress the part better." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as they landed on the young boy sitting beside Danielle. "And who is this, Danielle? Another attempt at a payday? You think bringing a child who looks vaguely like a park will move my father's heart? He's old, but he isn't blind." Danielle didn't flinch. She had spent 8 years building a fortress around her soul, and she wasn't about to let these ghosts breach the walls. But before she could speak, a small, steady hand reached out and covered hers. Min-jae, 7 years old and possessing a calm that would have unsettled a seasoned diplomat, didn't look at his mother. He looked directly at Miho. The boy didn't slouch. He sat with a terrifyingly precise posture, his chin lifted in a way that was hauntingly familiar to everyone in the room. "Lower your voice when you speak to my mother," Min-jae said. His voice wasn't the high-pitched chirp of a child. It was a low, resonant baritone in waiting, carrying an authority that seemed to physically push back against the room's hostility. "And I suggest you remember that my father owns the ground you're standing on." A silence, so heavy it felt subterranean, collapsed onto the table. Xiao Yan's wine glass stopped halfway to her lips, her hand trembling just enough to make the crystal ring. Miho's sneer died on his face, replaced by a look of profound, primal confusion. "What did you say, you little brat?" Miho hissed, though the venom in his voice was now laced with an unmistakable tremor. Min-jae didn't blink. He stared into Miho's eyes with a gaze that felt centuries old. "My father said that small men use loud voices to hide their fear. You are very loud, uncle. It makes you look very small." The word uncle hit the room like a physical blow. Xiao Yan stood up so abruptly her chair screeched against the marble floor. She leaned over the table, her eyes fixed on the boy's face. In the harsh, crystalline light of the chandelier, the truth was an unavoidable assault. The boy had the legendary golden eyes of the Park lineage, a rare, amber-tinted dark brown that hadn't appeared in the family since the great patriarch who founded the empire. He had the sharp, aristocratic jawline and the slight, haughty curve of the brow that were the genetic signatures of the true Park heirs. "Who is his father?" Xiao Yan whispered, her voice cracking. "Danielle, who is this boy's father? Miho has been sterilized for years. We know he is not the sire. Where did you get those eyes? Whose blood have you stolen to craft this lie?" "I haven't stolen anything, Xiao Yan," Danielle said, her voice like velvet wrapped around steel. "The blood in his veins is as pure as any in this room. Pure, perhaps, because it hasn't been thinned by cowardice." Miho lunged halfway across the table, his face contorted in a mask of rage and desperation. "It's a trick. She found a surrogate, a distant relative, someone. She's trying to stage a coup because she knows my father is dying." "Guard!" Get this woman and this imposter out of my house. Your house? Min-jae asked, tilting his head with a chilling, effortless arrogance. He looked around the room with an air of clinical assessment. My father says the bank's finished with this house months ago. He says you are just guests who haven't realized the party is over. The heavy, oak doors at the end of the hall didn't just open. They were thrown wide with a force that echoed like a gunshot. A silhouette stood in the doorway, framed by the blinding light of the foyer. He was tall, his shoulders broad enough to block out the world behind him, draped in a tailored charcoal suit that screamed of power that didn't need to raise its voice. Park Jun-suk stepped into the light, the black sheep. The son who had been exiled a decade ago and told he would never amount to anything. The man who had disappeared into the West and built a shadow kingdom that now eclipsed the Park dynasty. He didn't look at his mother. He didn't look at the cousin who had betrayed him. He walked straight to the head of the table, his eyes fixed on Danielle with a look of profound, protective devotion. Then he looked down at Min-jae. You did well, son, Jun-suk said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. But I'll take it from here. He turned his gaze toward the table, and for the first time in their lives, the Park elders saw what true power looked like. It wasn't in the gold leaf or the titles. It was in the eyes of the man they had discarded and the woman they had tried to break, standing together as the new architects of their ruin. The hush that followed wasn't just scandalized. It was the silence of a dynasty realizing it was already dead. The transition from the warmth of her present life to the frigid memories of Seoul felt like falling through thin ice. 8 years ago, the Park estate hadn't been a place of reclamation. It had been a slaughterhouse for Danielle's dignity. She remembered the humidity of that final July evening, the air thick and cloying as she stood in the center of the grand foyer, surrounded by the family that had promised to be her own, only to reveal themselves as a pack of wolves. At the center of the trap was Miho and the woman he had never truly let go of, Yuna, a daughter of a tech conglomerate whose purity and pedigree were constantly held up as a mirror to Danielle's perceived inadequacies. Danielle had found them together in the study, but before she could utter a word of betrayal, the script was flipped. Yuna had let out a piercing, rehearsed scream, clutching her throat where a 5-carat heirloom sapphire necklace usually sat. Within seconds, the household staff and the Park elders had swarmed the room. Miho didn't look at Danielle with guilt. He looked at her with a terrifying, calculated coldness. Give it back, Danielle, he had commanded, his voice loud enough for the eavesdropping servants to hear. I knew you were struggling to adjust, but to steal from a guest? To steal a Park family heirloom? I don't have it, Miho, Danielle had whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. I just walked in. You know I didn't take it. But the evidence had already been planted. Seo Yen, the matriarch, had marched toward Danielle's coat hanging near the door, reaching into the silk-lined pocket with the practiced grace of a magician. She pulled out the sapphire, the blue stone glinting like an accusation under the hallway lights. The gasp that went up from the gathered family was a death knell. A thief in our house, Seo Yen had hissed, her face contorting with a satisfaction she couldn't quite mask. A common girl from the West, brought into our sanctuary, only to spit on our generosity. You have disgraced my son. You have stained our name. The trial lasted less than an hour. There was no lawyer, no chance for Danielle to speak, and certainly no mercy. Miho sat on a velvet armchair, watching with detached boredom as his mother dictated the terms of Danielle's erasure. They didn't just want a divorce. They wanted an annulment of her very existence. You will sign these papers, the family attorney had stated, sliding a thick stack of documents across the table. You will admit to the theft. You will waive all rights to alimony, assets, or future claims against the Park Corporation. In exchange, the family will decline to press criminal charges. You will be escorted to Incheon Airport tonight. If you are still on Korean soil by sunrise, the police will be waiting. Danielle looked at Miho, pleading for a flicker of the man who had once promised to protect her from the world. He simply looked away, adjusting his cufflink. "It's better this way, Danielle," he muttered. "You never really fit. You're a glitch in the system. We're just fixing the error." The expulsion was clinical. They didn't allow her to pack her own bags. A maid brought out a single suitcase filled with the clothes she had arrived in, the unrefined, American outfits they had once mocked. She was marched to a black sedan by 2 security guards who treated her with a silent disdain reserved for a violent criminal. As the car sped through the rain-slicked streets of Seoul toward the airport, Danielle stared at the neon lights blurring past, her hands shaking so violently she had to sit on them. She had been stripped of her home, her reputation, and her husband in a matter of hours. She remembered the cold weight of the $50,000 they had thrown at her as hush money, a pittance compared to the park billions, just enough to ensure she could disappear. At the terminal, the guard didn't leave until he watched her pass through security. He stood like a sentinel of the park's shadow, ensuring the contaminant was successfully removed from their pristine world. Danielle had sat at the gate, huddled in a thin sweater, feeling the eyes of the world on her. She was the black girl who had tried to fly too high and had her wings clipped by a dynasty. But as the plane lifted off the tarmac, leaving the lights of South Korea behind, the crushing weight of humiliation began to shift. It began to harden into something dense and sharp. They had cast her to the wolves, thinking she would be devoured. They hadn't realized that the glitch they tried to fix was the only thing in that house that was real. She had gripped the armrests of her seat, her eyes burning with unshed tears, and made a silent vow to the darkness outside the window. They had taken her name, but they couldn't take her mind. They had taken her present, but she would own the future. They thought they were throwing away a waitress from Georgia, but they were releasing a storm that would one day find its way back to their front door. Now, sitting back at that same mahogany table 8 years later, Danielle felt that old coldness settle into a simmer of triumph. The wolves were still there, but she was no longer the prey. She looked at Seo Yan's trembling hands and Miho's panicked eyes, and she realized the most delicious truth of all. The error hadn't been fixed. It had just been waiting for the right moment to crash the entire system. New York City in autumn was a symphony of gray pavement and golden leaves, a world away from the humid, suffocating corridors of Seoul. For Danielle, it was the place where she finally began to breathe. 3 years had passed since her expulsion, and she had rebuilt herself piece by piece, trading her broken heart for a master's degree in architecture. She was no longer a victim. She was a creator of spaces, a woman who understood that the strongest structures required the deepest foundations. She met him on a rain-slicked Tuesday at a small, dimly lit gallery in Chelsea. Danielle was standing before a blueprint of an old cathedral, tracing the lines of the flying buttresses with her eyes, when a voice like low-frequency cello music vibrated beside her. "The beauty isn't in what holds it up," the man said, not looking at her, but at the sketch. "It's in the tension. It only stays standing because the weight is fighting against itself." Danielle turned to see a man who seemed to be carved from the very shadows of the room. He was dressed in a simple black turtleneck and a tailored overcoat, his presence so commanding that the rest of the gallery seemed to blur into the periphery. He had the sharp, striking features of a scholar king, but his eyes, dark, liquid, and weary, held a depth of loneliness that Danielle recognized instantly. It was the look of someone who had walked through fire and found the heat preferable to the coldness of home. "Tension is just another word for survival," Danielle replied, her voice steady. The man finally looked at her, and for a second, time seemed to snag on a jagged edge. There was a flicker of something in his gaze, recognition?
Surprise?
But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Most people prefer to look at the stained glass," he noted. "They don't want to see the bones of the thing." "I've had enough of pretty surfaces," Danielle said. "I'm an architect. I only care about what's real." He offered a rare, ghost-like smile that didn't quite reach his eyes but softened the hard line of his jaw. "Then we have that in common."
I'm Chun.
They walked for hours that night, the city lights reflecting in the puddles like fallen stars. June was a man of few words, but the ones he chose were weighted with meaning. He told her he was a consultant in the tech sector, a man who fixed things that were broken. He spoke of a family that had demanded he be a puppet, and the day he had finally cut his own strings. They wanted a son who would bow, June said as they stopped near a railing overlooking the Hudson River. I wanted a life that was mine. So, I took the only thing they couldn't control, my mind, and I left. They told me I'd be nothing without the name. Danielle felt a sudden, sharp pang of kinship. My family, my ex-husband's family, told me the same thing. They framed me, humiliated me, and threw me out like trash. They thought they took everything. June turned to her, the wind whipping his dark hair across his brow. And did they? They took a version of me that didn't exist anyway, Danielle realized aloud, the truth crystallizing in the cold New York air. They took the girl who wanted to be loved by them. They left the woman who didn't need them. June reached out, his fingers grazing her hand for a fleeting moment, a touch that felt like an electric current. Being an outcast is a lonely throne, Danielle. But it's a throne nonetheless. You are the architect of your own life now. No one can evict you from a house you built with your own hands. For the next few months, they became each other's sanctuary. They met in quiet libraries and obscure jazz clubs, bonding over their shared status as ghosts in their own lineages. June was a mystery wrapped in a riddle. He knew the inner workings of the global markets, he spoke 4 languages, and he carried himself with an innate nobility that he seemed to despise. He never mentioned the name Park. He never mentioned that he was the eldest son, the genius heir who had been erased from the family records for refusing to marry a woman he didn't love. To Danielle, he was just June, the man who saw her scars and called them beautiful, the man who understood that her blackness and her brilliance were not contradictions but a superpower. He was the first person to treat her as an equal, not a trophy or a trespasser. One evening, as they sat in a small bistro, June watched her sketch a bridge on a napkin. You're going to build things that last centuries, Danielle, he said softly. And you? She asked, looking up. What are you building, June? His expression darkened for a moment, a flash of the predator behind the philosopher. I'm building an ending, he said, for a story that should have been finished a long time ago. Danielle didn't ask what he meant. She didn't realize then that his ending and her justice were destined to collide. She only knew that in the middle of a city of 8 million people, she had found the one person who spoke her secret language. She was falling for a man whose last name she didn't know, unaware that he was the very bridge that would eventually lead her back to the den of the wolves, not as a victim, but as a queen. Their union was not forged in a ballroom or sanctioned by a board of directors. It was consecrated in a quiet, sun-drenched corner of City Hall, away from the prying eyes of the dynasties that had tried to claim them. To the world, Park Jun-suk was still a ghost, and Danielle Monroe was a rising name in architecture whose past was a closed book. In that small room, they weren't the black ex-wife or the exiled heir. They were simply 2 survivors who had found a home in each other. Jun-suk had finally revealed his full name on the night he proposed, standing on the balcony of his minimalist Brooklyn penthouse. He had told her everything, the weight of the Park legacy, the cruelty of his brother Miho, and the reason he had let the world believe he had vanished into obscurity. He expected Danielle to run, to fear the toxicity of the family she had already escaped. Instead, she had taken his face in her hands and told him that a name was just a shadow, and they were the light. They married in secret, a private rebellion that felt more sacred than any televised gala. There were no photographers, no park elders to sneer at the guest list, and no jewel-encrusted tiaras that felt like shackles. Jun-suk gave her a simple band of recycled platinum, a symbol of something that had been broken and made stronger through the fire. The first years of their marriage were a blur of building empires. While Danielle designed skyscrapers that challenged the New York skyline, Jun-suk quietly acquired the distressed debt of international conglomerates, moving like a phantom through the financial world. They lived in a world of their own making, a bubble of peace where the only language spoken was one of mutual respect and intellectual fire. Then came Min-jae. His birth was the moment the two worlds they occupied, the heritage of the Parks and the resilience of the Monroes, finally fused into something indestructible. Danielle remembered the first time Jun-suk held his son in the sterile light of the hospital room. The man who was known in the business world as a cold-blooded shark had wept silently as he traced the infant's features. Min-jae was a miracle of genetics. He was born with skin the color of warm mahogany and eyes that held the unmistakable, piercing amber of the Park lineage. Even as an infant, he didn't cry with the frantic energy of other children. He watched the world with a calm, discerning gaze that made the doctors pause. He was the bridge they hadn't known they were building. "He looks like a king," Jun-suk had whispered, his voice thick with a sudden, protective ferocity. "He has the eyes of my grandfather, but he has your heart, Danielle. He will never know the hunger of needing their approval." As Min-jae grew, he became the ultimate fusion of his parents. By age 5, he was fluently navigating the complexities of both English and Korean, shifting between them with a precocious grace. Danielle taught him the history of her people, the strength found in struggle, the beauty of the diaspora, while Jun-suk taught him the strategic mind of the Parks, stripped of their malice. They raised him in a home filled with books, blueprints, and laughter, far from the toxic smog of the Seoul estate. Min-jae knew he was a Park, but to him, being a Park meant being like his father, strong, fair, and silent until it was time to speak the truth. He grew up seeing his mother not as a victim, but as the architect who had built their world from the ground up. However, as Min-jae's features sharpened, the resemblance to the Park dynasty became impossible to ignore. He wasn't just a child, he was a walking, talking piece of evidence. Jun-suk knew that eventually, the collision with the past was inevitable. He began to prepare, not for a reconciliation, but for a reckoning. He watched his son play in the park, his golden eyes catching the light, and he knew that Min-jae was the weapon that would finally shatter the Park family's illusions of superiority. The secret union had given them a son who was a sovereign nation unto himself. He was the heir to a fortune the Parks didn't even know existed, and the protector of a mother they thought they had destroyed. Danielle watched her husband and son together and realized that the union wasn't just about a marriage certificate. It was about creating a new bloodline, one that didn't require a pedigree to be noble and didn't require a scandal to be powerful. The stage was being set. The child who united two worlds was about to walk into the one world that had tried to prevent his very existence. And this time, Danielle wouldn't be standing alone. The descent of the Park dynasty began not with a crash, but with a desperate, suffocating silence. In the hallowed halls of the Newport Beach estate, the gold leaf was beginning to flake, and the air smelled faintly of dust and denial. The family's aggressive expansion into the tech sector had backfired spectacularly, leaving them tethered to a mountain of bad debt and predatory loans. They were a house of cards waiting for a breeze, and the only person who held the power to stabilize their crumbling empire was the mysterious majority shareholder of the investment firm that had been quietly swallowing their liabilities. It was Seo Yen who conceived the desperate gambit. She sat in her darkened sunroom, clutching a glass of lukewarm tea, her mind churning with the cold pragmatism that had always been her survival mechanism. Years ago, a significant portion of the family's private trust had been linked to a legal loophole involving the cleansing of assets during Miho and Danielle's divorce, a paper trail of the very frame-up they had used to exile her. Now, with the bank circling, they needed a scapegoat to sign off on a series of retroactive restitutions that would allow them to liquefy those frozen funds without triggering a federal audit. "She will be desperate," Seo Yen told Miho, her voice a dry rasp. 8 years in the West with no support? She is likely drowning in debt herself. A woman like that, A girl from her background will do anything for a few $100,000 and the chance to sit at a table like ours again. Miho, looking haggard and graying at the temples, nodded with a hollow sort of hope. He remembered Danielle as the woman who had wept when he raised his voice, the girl who had looked at the park name with wide-eyed reverence. He assumed that the years had only served to sharpen her poverty, making her more pliable, more broken. To them, Danielle Monroe was still the waitress from Georgia, a disposable tool they could pull out of the trash when they needed to mop up a mess. The invitation was sent not with an apology, but with the cold formality of a royal summons. It arrived at Danielle's firm, though they sent it to her old, maiden name, a deliberate slight intended to remind her that her time as a park was an erased mistake. The letter spoke of family closure and a generous offer to resolve past misunderstandings. It was an invitation to a dinner that was, in reality, a trap designed to buy her signature and her silence for a pittance. When Danielle received the heavy, cream-colored envelope, she didn't tremble. She sat in her glass-walled office overlooking the Manhattan skyline, the very city she had helped reshape, and felt a slow, dark amusement coil in her chest. She saw through the desperation of the high-grade stationery. She smelled the fear behind the elegant calligraphy. They thought they were inviting a beggar to their feast. They didn't realize they were opening the gates to the very person who already owned the deed to the castle. "They want to play at being benefactors," she whispered to the empty room, her thumb tracing the embossed park crest. June Suk appeared in the doorway of her office, leaning against the frame with the effortless cool of a predator who had already won. "They've sent it, then?" "A dinner," Danielle said, looking up at her husband. "To reconcile. I suspect they need something they think I'm too poor to refuse." June Suk's eyes darkened with a flash of the lethal protective instinct that had become the bedrock of their marriage. "They still see the girl they cast to the wolves. They have no idea that the wolves now report to you." He walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch a steadying anchor. "We could end this now. I could pull the plug on their credit by morning." "No," Danielle said, her voice dropping into a register of pure, architectural precision. "Let them set the table. Let them prepare their insults. I want to see the moment the realization hits them. I want them to look at Min Jae and see every lie they ever told coming back to haunt them." The park spent the week preparing their barbs, rehearsing the condescending speeches they would deliver to the poor girl they expected to see. They planned to offer her a check for $50,000, the same insult they had thrown at her 8 years ago, assuming she would fall to her knees in gratitude. They prepared a menu of traditional Korean delicacies she had once struggled to name, a final test of her unrefined palate. They were so blinded by their own elitism, so convinced of Danielle's stagnation, that they failed to do the one thing any smart gambler would do. They didn't check the current status of the person they were trying to cheat. They didn't see the billionaire husband. They didn't see the world-class architect. They didn't see the lioness. As Danielle packed her bags for the flight to Newport Beach, she didn't pack the clothes of a victim. She packed a wardrobe of war. She was going back to the house that had tried to destroy her, not to seek their forgiveness, but to witness their collapse. The invitation of greed had been sent, and Danielle Monroe was more than happy to RSVP. The Parks thought they were inviting a ghost to dinner. They were about to find out that some ghosts return with a hunger that can only be satisfied by the truth. The heavy oak doors of the dining hall didn't just swing open. They yielded to the sheer force of a man who no longer recognized the authority of the name Park. As June Suk stepped into the radius of the chandelier's light, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He moved with a predatory elegance, his charcoal suit absorbing the light as he walked toward the head of the table where his mother, Seo Yen, sat frozen. The silence was absolute. Miho had slumped back into his chair, his face drained of color, looking like a ghost of the man who had been mocking Danielle only moments before. Seo Yan's hand shook as she set her tea down, the porcelain clattering against the saucer like a frantic heartbeat. "June Suk?" she whispered, the name sounding like a curse she had long forgotten how to speak. You were dead to this family. You were erased. Erasure is a tool for the weak, Mother. Jun Suk replied, his voice a low, resonant hum that filled every corner of the vast room. He didn't look at her with anger. He looked at her with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a dying specimen. You spent 10 years trying to pretend I didn't exist, while I spent 10 years ensuring that your existence would eventually depend entirely on me. He reached the head of the table and placed a hand firmly on Danielle's shoulder. The gesture was both a shield and a declaration. He looked down at Min Jae, who had remained perfectly composed, and gave the boy a brief, approving nod. Then, he turned his gaze back to the family elders, his eyes flashing with the cold brilliance of a winter sky. You invited Danielle here tonight because you are desperate, Jun Suk continued, his voice hardening. You've watched your stock plummet for 36 consecutive months. You've watched your creditors vanish and your credit lines freeze. You've been searching for the ghost that has been shorting your stock, the invisible hand that has been systematically dismantling your legacy from the inside out. He reached into his inner coat pocket and pulled out a single, black-sealed document, sliding it across the mahogany table until it tapped against Seo Yan's trembling fingers. The ghost has a name, Jun Suk said. I am the founder of Apex Capital. I am the one who bet against you when you chose greed over honor. I am the one who bought your debt when you were too arrogant to realize you were drowning. And as of 4 o'clock this afternoon, I am the primary shareholder of the Park Corporation. Miho let out a choked, desperate sound. That's impossible. Apex is a Western firm. They would never. Apex is mine. Jun Suk interrupted, his gaze shifting to his brother with a lethality that made Miho flinch. I built it in the shadow of your failure. Every time you insulted my wife, I shorted another 10,000 shares. Every time you sent a legal threat to her office, I acquired another subsidiary. You didn't just lose your company, Miho. You sold it to me, one insult at a time. The realization hit the room like a physical shock. The Parks had spent the evening trying to humiliate a woman they thought was a beggar, unaware that the man who held their lives in his hands was her husband. They had been performing a play for an audience that already owned the theater. Seo Yan looked at Danielle, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and dawning comprehension. She saw the emerald silk, the poise, and the unwavering strength, and realized she wasn't looking at a waitress from Georgia. She was looking at the woman who had helped the black sheep build a kingdom that had now swallowed her own. Jun Suk pulled out a chair for himself at the head of the table, the seat traditionally reserved for the patriarch. He sat down, leaning back with an air of absolute sovereignty. The dinner is over, he said, the finality of his tone vibrating through the room. The charity you intended to offer Danielle is no longer necessary. Instead, we are here to discuss the terms of your surrender. You wanted to talk about family closure, Mother? Let's talk about it. But first, let's talk about what happens when the king you exiled returns to find his throne occupied by thieves. He didn't raise his voice, but the authority in it was absolute. The king had returned, and the crown he wore was one of his own making, forged in the fires of betrayal and polished by the hands of the woman they had tried to destroy. The Parks weren't just facing bankruptcy. They were facing the architect of their own extinction. The dining hall, once a theater of practiced cruelty, had transformed into a courtroom where the air hung heavy with the scent of ozone and old, rotting secrets. Seo Yan looked from Jun Suk to the boy, her breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches. The revelation of the stock takeover had wounded her pride, but the sight of Min Jae was a threat to her very reality. If this child was truly a Park, the son of the firstborn heir, the internal hierarchy she had spent decades manipulating would vanish in an instant. It is a fabrication, Seo Yan spat, her voice trembling as she clung to the edge of the table. You have always been clever, Jun Suk. You found a child with the right features, a woman with the right grudge, and you've spent years grooming them for this theatrical performance. You expect us to hand over the keys to our history because of a resemblance and a few stock certificates? Miho, sensing a final foothold in his mother's denial, straightened his silk tie, though sweat beaded at his hairline. She's right. Modern science can be bought, and faces can be mimicked. We demand a formal DNA test. We want an independent laboratory, one of our choosing, to prove this boy has even a drop of our blood before he is allowed to sit at this table. Danielle felt the familiar surge of protective fire in her chest, but before she could speak, the heavy silence at the far end of the table was broken by a sound like dry parchment tearing. Park Jun-suk's father, the patriarch who had sat in grim silence throughout the evening, shifted in his chair. He was a man of fading strength, but eyes like flint, a man who had built the original empire with his bare hands before his children began to bleed it dry. Enough, the old man rasped. His gaze wasn't on the legal documents or his trembling wife. It was fixed entirely on Min-jae. Bring the boy to me. Jun-suk's hand tightened slightly on Danielle's shoulder, a silent question passing between them. Danielle looked at her son. Min-jae didn't look afraid. He looked curious, his small shoulders squared with the same quiet dignity his father possessed. With a gentle nod from Danielle, the boy stood and walked the length of the table, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. The patriarch reached out a gnarled, liver-spotted hand. Seo Yen moved to intervene, but the old man silenced her with a single, sharp glance that carried the weight of 50 years of command. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowed as he inspected the child's face. They call it the dragon's mark, the patriarch whispered, his voice suddenly thick with an emotion no one in the room had ever heard from him. My grandfather had it. I have it. But it skipped my sons. It skipped Miho, and it skipped you, Jun-suk. With a trembling finger, the old man gently turned Min-jae's head to the side, pulling back the dark hair behind the boy's left ear. There, tucked against the hairline, was a small, distinct birthmark, a cluster of 3 dark pigments shaped like a perfect, jagged constellation. It was a genetic anomaly, a royal trait whispered about in the family's private annals, a mark that appeared only once every few generations in the direct line of the firstborn. Seo Yan's face went from pale to a ghostly, translucent white. She knew the legend. She had spent years searching for that mark on Miho's children with Yuna, only to find nothing. The patriarch's hand began to shake, but not from age. He looked at Min-jae, really looked at him, and saw the golden eyes, reflecting his own forgotten youth. He saw the defiance and the brilliance, a fire that hadn't been thinned out by the greed that plagued his other descendants. DNA is for lawyers and liars, the patriarch said, his voice regaining a sudden, terrifying strength. He looked up at Seo Yen and Miho, his contempt visible. The blood has spoken for itself. This boy is not an imposter. He is the answer to every prayer I stopped saying 10 years ago. The old man turned his gaze to Danielle. For the first time, he didn't see a social climber or a waitress. He saw the woman who had preserved the true Park legacy in the heart of a foreign city, while his own family was busy destroying it in the name of tradition. You kept him whole, the patriarch acknowledged, a subtle bow of his head that sent a shockwave through the room. You protected the seed when the soil here was poison. Miho let out a weak, pathetic sound of protest, but the patriarch ignored him, reaching out to rest his hand on Min-jae's shoulder. The bloodline test was over. There was no need for needles or laboratories. The ghost of the Park ancestors lived in the boy's eyes and was etched into his skin. The dinner had begun as an attempt to humiliate an ex-wife, but it had ended in the crowning of a new heir and the total, irreversible delegitimization of the monsters who had tried to cast him aside. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from a courtroom to a funeral, the silence no longer heavy with anticipation but with the crushing weight of a finality they couldn't escape. Danielle stood up slowly, the emerald silk of her gown whispering against the chair. She didn't look like a woman seeking revenge. She looked like a woman finishing a blueprint. From her designer clutch, she pulled a slim, matte black tablet, and a single folder of ivory parchment. "My son is a park by blood," Danielle said, her voice clear and resonant, echoing off the high-vaulted ceilings. "But he was raised by a Monroe. And in my house, we don't just survive the storm. We learn how to own the wind." She tapped the screen, and the hidden projectors in the dining hall, once used to display the family's art collection, flickered to life. Instead of landscapes, the walls were suddenly covered in spreadsheets, wire transfer receipts, and offshore account ledgers. The names on the documents weren't foreign. They were the private signatures of Sayo, Yen, and Miho. "For years, you've told the world that I was a thief," Danielle continued, walking toward the fireplace where the family crest was carved into the stone. "You used me as a convenient shadow to hide your own light-fingered greed. While you were busy framing me for a sapphire necklace 8 years ago, Miho was siphoning millions into a shell company in the Cayman Islands to cover his gambling debts. And mother," she turned her gaze to Sayo Yen, who looked as though she were turning to stone, "you were signing off on the charity tax breaks that made it all possible." "This is libel," Miho screamed, though his voice cracked, sounding small and pathetic against the backdrop of the digital evidence. "Those are private family records. You can't possibly have access to those." "I have access because I am no longer an outsider," Danielle said, sliding the ivory folder across the table toward the patriarch. "Jun Suk didn't just buy your debt. He restructured it. And as part of the settlement for the years of defamation and the illegal seizure of my dignity, he transferred the physical assets of this estate into a private trust. A trust that is managed by Monroe Architecture and Design." The patriarch opened the folder, his eyes scanning the deed. His hands didn't shake this time. He looked at the final page, where Danielle's elegant signature sat beneath the official seal of the state. "What is she saying?" Sayo Yen hissed, grabbing the papers from her husband's hand. Her eyes darted over the legalese until they landed on the terrifying truth. This is a notice of eviction?" "It's a foreclosure," Danielle corrected, her tone as cool as a winter morning. "This house, the grounds, the very chair you're sitting in, they belong to me. You spent 8 years making sure I had nowhere to go. Now, I'm returning the favor." The irony was a physical weight in the room. The Parks had invited Danielle to dinner to buy her silence with a pittance, intending to use her one last time to save their status. Instead, they had sat her at the head of a table she already owned. "You can't do this," Miho stammered, his eyes darting toward the security guards at the door, but the guards didn't move. They were on Jun Suk's payroll now. "This is our legacy. Our history. Legacy is built on honor, Miho. You built yours on a lie," Danielle said. She leaned over the table, her face inches from Sayo Yan's. "You have 24 hours to pack your personal effects. The jewelry, the art, and the furniture stay. They were purchased with the money you stole from the shareholders, money that now belongs to my husband's firm. Consider it back rent for the years you spent living in a house of cards." Jun Suk stood up, moving to Danielle's side. He didn't need to speak. His presence was the final period at the end of the sentence. He looked at his father, the patriarch, who was watching Danielle with a strange, grim sort of respect. "The car is waiting for you, father," Jun Suk said quietly. "There is a medical suite prepared for you in the city, far away from the stress of this collapse. But as for the rest of them," he glanced at Miho and Sayo Yen, "they can find their own way. I hear the motels in the valley are quite affordable." Danielle took Minjae's hand. The boy looked up at her, his golden eyes bright with the understanding that the world was finally right side up. She didn't feel the need to gloat. The sight of Sayo Yen clutching a worthless piece of parchment and Miho staring at the digital record of his own crimes was enough. She had been cast to the wolves as a victim, but she had returned as the owner of the forest. The roof over their heads was no longer the park's sanctuary. It was Danielle's first acquisition. And as she turned to leave the room, she knew she would never have to look back again. The heavy silence that followed the foreclosure announcement was broken only by the sound of Xiao Yan's muffled sobs and the distant, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock that no longer kept time for this family. Danielle watched as her former mother-in-law collapsed into a chair, her manicured hands clutching at the air as if trying to grab hold of the vanishing threads of her status. Miho stood paralyzed, his eyes darting between the digital evidence of his crimes and the brother who had surpassed him in every way that mattered. "Don't look for a way out, Miho," Jun-suk said, his voice quiet but final. "The authorities have already been briefed. The forensic accountants are at your office as we speak. You spent years trying to erase Danielle. Now, you've succeeded only in erasing yourself." Danielle reached down and took Min-jae's hand. The boy looked up at her, his expression serene, possessing a wisdom that the adults in this room had discarded decades ago. She felt a profound lightness spreading through her chest, the weight of 8 years of shame, of whispered accusations, and of the cold, soul rain, finally evaporating in the heat of her own truth. She didn't need their apologies. Their ruin was not her victory. Her victory was the fact that she no longer cared if they lived or died. As they turned to leave, the patriarch called out from the shadows of the hallway. "Jun-suk." Jun-suk paused, his hand on the door handle. He didn't turn around, but he listened. "He is the best of us," the old man rasped, gesturing toward Min-jae. "Build him a world that is better than the one I gave you." "I already have," Jun-suk replied. They walked out of the mansion, the heavy doors thudding shut behind them with a sound of absolute closure. The night air was cool and salt-kissed, carrying the scent of the nearby Pacific. At the bottom of the grand stone steps, a sleek, black electric sedan sat idling, its headlights cutting through the darkness like twin beacons. Jun-suk opened the door for Danielle, his eyes lingering on her face with a soft, fierce pride. "Are you ready?" he asked. "I've been ready for 8 years," she whispered. As Jun-suk climbed into the driver's seat and Min-jae settled into the back, Danielle looked back at the estate one last time. From the outside, it still looked like a palace, but she knew the rot had finally reached the foundation. The lights in the dining hall flickered and died, a symbolic end to a dynasty built on the suffering of others. The car moved silently down the long, winding driveway, leaving the Newport Beach fortress in the rearview mirror. As they reached the highway, the horizon began to bleed into shades of deep violet, bruised orange, and a brilliant, hopeful gold. The sun was beginning to climb over the edge of the world, shattering the darkness of the longest night Danielle had ever known. In the back seat, Min-jae leaned against the window, watching the sunrise with wide, wondering eyes. "Mom," he asked softly, "is the bad story over now?" Danielle turned in her seat, reaching back to stroke his cheek. "The old story is over, Min-jae. But our story? Our story is just beginning." Jun-suk reached across the center console, taking Danielle's hand in his. His grip was steady, a physical promise of the life they had built on the ruins of their past. He didn't need to say anything. The way he looked at her, not as a prize or a victim, but as his equal, his architect, and his love, said everything. They weren't just driving away from a scandal or a family, they were driving toward a new dynasty. It wouldn't be a dynasty of cold stone and stolen jewelry, but one built on the blueprints of integrity, the strength of resilience, and a love that had been tested by fire and emerged as diamond. The car accelerated, merging into the flow of the morning light. The road ahead was wide and open, reflecting the shimmering brilliance of the rising sun. Behind them, the park name was a crumbling ruin. In front of them, the world was waiting to be redesigned. Danielle leaned her head back against the leather seat, closed her eyes, and for the first time in nearly a decade, she let the warmth of the sun soak into her skin, knowing she was finally, irrevocably